Welcome to another deep dive. You ready to go deep? Today we're diving into the 2008 financial crisis. And you might think, oh yeah, 2008, I know about that. But trust me, we're going way beyond the headlines. This event, it sent out shockwaves that are, well, they're still shaping our world today.
It really is mind-boggling how something, starting with subprime mortgages
Mm-hmm.
can end up triggering, well, basically a global economic earthquake.
Right.
We're talking a full-blown recession, like the kind that ends up in the history textbooks.
All right, so let's break this down. We know the U.S. was hit hard, but how far did this damage really spread?
Imagine like a domino effect, but on a global scale. Right? Economies like, well, Germany, the UK, their GDPs tanked. I mean, down 4 and 5%, just like that. And it wasn't just them. It was like even China and India. They were on this huge growth streak, and that growth it slowed way down.
So this was a global thing, a global slowdown. What did that look like for like everyday people?
Well, think about the industries tied to finance, like really tied to it. Construction, financial services, I mean, those were just decimated. Spain, their unemployment rate, it went up to, get this, 20%.
Yeah.
And even in the U.S., over 10%. We're talking millions out of work.
Yeah, you hear unemployment rate and it's just numbers, but it's people's lives, right? It's lost savings, foreclosures, families struggling to, even put food on the table. It's a tough picture.
It absolutely is. And on top of all that, the stock market was like in free fall.
Hmm.
People saw their retirement savings, everything they'd worked for just vanish overnight. It was a recipe for disaster, economic hardship on a massive scale.
So what did governments do? I mean, with this meltdown happening, did they just, I don't know, stand by and watch?
No, they had to act.
Mm-hmm.
And they did.
Yeah.
But the measures were, let's just say, drastic. Massive bailouts. We're talking about banks, financial institutions like in the U.S., that $700 billion troubled asset relief program. Those were, they were controversial. But the thinking was, if we don't do this, the whole system could just collapse.
Like trying to, I don't know, stop a wildfire from spreading. Right. But these bailouts, weren't they incredibly expensive? Like, what was the long-term cost?
Though they were expensive, definitely. And that's where the long-term consequences really kick in. Government debt, it's skyrocketed. Greece, for example, their debt to GDP ratio, it climbed to 180%.
Yeah.
180. And that led to, well, fears of sovereign debt crises, particularly in Europe.
So they're trying to fix one problem, but maybe creating another one down the road.
Exactly. And it's important to remember, this wasn't just about numbers on a spreadsheet. This was playing out in people's lives and their communities, their families. The impact of this, it went way beyond just Wall Street.
Right. Let's get into that. So we've talked about the economic earthquake, right? But what about the social tremors? How did this crisis reshape, like, the social fabric?
One of the biggest things, and it's really concerning, was that the gap between the rich and the poor, it just widened. Think about it. When the housing market crashed, those who were already struggling, they were the ones who lost the most. They had subprime mortgages. They had less to fall back on.
So the crisis, it actually made existing inequalities. It made them worse.
It did. In the U.S., for example, the poverty rate, it jumped from about 12% to over 15% in just a few years. Millions more people below the poverty line struggling to just get by. And it wasn't just income either.
Right. The whole idea of well-being, right? It's bigger than just a paycheck.
Exactly. Job losses, the financial strain, it all led to, well, it led to more mental health issues. Anxiety, depression, even in some cases suicide. Imagine that stress, losing your home, your job, and not knowing how you're going to take care of your family.
It's a really grim picture. Were there other signs, tangible signs of this social distress?
One of the most visible ones, definitely, was the rise in homelessness. People losing their homes due to foreclosures, and many ended up on the streets. It was a very stark reminder of the human cost of all of this.
It's easy to get lost in the numbers and the economics of it all, but these are real people's lives.
Absolutely. And all of this, it was happening against a backdrop of, well, I guess you could say growing anger, disillusionment with the systems that were supposed to protect people.
So the social fabric's fraying, people are losing faith in the establishment, right? Where did that lead? Did it have any like political consequences?
Oh, it definitely did. There's this erosion of trust in institutions.
Hmm.
Banks, governments, regulators, everyone who was seen as having failed to prevent this whole thing.
People felt like they'd been betrayed by the very institutions they were supposed to be able to rely on.
That's right. And that anger, that distrust, it fueled political activism. In the U.S., you had the Occupy Wall Street movement,
Yeah.
people camping out right in the financial district, denouncing corporate greed, economic inequality.
It was a powerful image, like a symbol of how disillusioned people were with the way things were.
It was, and it wasn't just the U.S. Similar movements, similar protests, they were happening all over the world.
Yeah.
Europe, for example, saw the rise of these anti-austerity parties, people rejecting the harsh cuts to social programs that were being implemented, because of the crisis.
So this crisis it was shaking things up politically, challenging the established power structures, right? And giving rise to these new movements, new ideologies.
Yeah, it was a time of huge upheaval, uncertainty, the world trying to grapple with what had happened, with the consequences of this meltdown and trying to figure out a way forward.
We've covered a lot of ground, that's for sure. Before we move on, let's take a minute and think about what we've learned so far. What's stood out to you the most?
For me, it's the interconnectedness of it all. How something that starts with, U.S. housing can end up having these huge, far-reaching consequences for the whole global economy. Social structures,
Yeah.
people's mental and physical health, everything. It really shows you how fragile our systems are, and how much our actions, how much they can really ripple outwards.
I'm with you on that. It's a powerful reminder that we're all part of this intricate web,
Right.
right? And that even things that seem isolated, they can have global consequences. But we've only just scratched the surface here. Join us for part 2, where we'll dig into how the world responded to this crisis and
Yep.
what lessons, if any, were learned.
Welcome back to our deep dive into, the 2008 financial crisis. We've just kind of gone through those initial shock waves, right? That economic earthquake, those social tremors.
Right.
Now let's shift gears a bit, focus on the global response. How did it actually react to this crisis?
It's easy to feel overwhelmed by the sheer scale of this, right? Global financial meltdown, millions of people impacted, governments scrambling to, I don't know, even figure out what to do. What were the first steps? What did they do to try and stabilize things?
Okay, so imagine a house fire, right? The first thing you do is put out the flames, stop it from spreading, from causing more damage. That's exactly what governments, central banks, they were trying to do. Contain the crisis, prevent a complete, collapse of the financial system.
Yeah, had to act fast. So what did they actually do? What actions did they take?
Remember those massive bailouts we talked about in part 1? Those were key. They injected liquidity into the banking system. It was like a lifeline, right, to prevent a total freeze-up. In the U.S., for example, they had that Troubled Asset Relief Program, TARP, they call it, authorized up to $700 billion to buy up troubled assets from banks.
That sounds, I don't know, it sounds risky, pumping billions of dollars into a system that's already in trouble. Were there any concerns about the long-term consequences of that?
Oh, definitely. Definitely concerns. I mean, these bailouts, it came with a hefty price tag. Government debt, it increased significantly. And as we discussed earlier, that led to fears of sovereign debt crises in some countries. It was a gamble, but a lot of people argue that it was necessary to prevent, a complete economic meltdown.
So they were trying to stop the bleeding, but also knowing that there could be complications down the line. But beyond these immediate actions, were there any efforts to, I don't know, address the underlying causes of the crisis to try and prevent something like this from happening again?
Absolutely. There was this recognition that the pre-crisis regulatory framework, it had failed. It was too lax. It allowed for too much risk-taking. It didn't protect consumers. So there was this big push for financial reform.
Can you give us some concrete examples? Like what did these reforms actually change?
Well, in the U.S., you had the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act. It was passed in 2010. And it was huge. New rules for banks, more oversight, new agencies to monitor systemic risk.
So they were trying to close the loopholes, the things that allowed the crisis to happen in the first place.
Exactly. And it wasn't just the U.S., it was global. Similar reforms were happening in Europe, other parts of the world. You had the Basel III Accord, which was a global regulatory framework. It strengthened capital requirements for banks, to make them more resilient to financial shocks.
It sounds like a major overhaul, like they were rewriting the global financial rule book, but this was a global crisis. Were there any coordinated international efforts to deal with it?
Definitely, and this is really important. The crisis really showed just how interconnected the global financial system is. No country could solve this on their own. So you had institutions like the G20, the big economies, and the International Monitor from the IMF. They played a vital role in coordinating responses, providing financial assistance to countries that needed it.
So it was a massive global effort to
Mm.
contain the damage and try to prevent a wider economic depression. Did it work? Did the world actually pull back from the brink?
It's complicated. I mean, on the one hand, yes, the world avoided a complete collapse. That was
Yeah.
a real fear early on. The coordinated response, while it wasn't, perfect, it did help. Stabilize markets, prevented a repeat of the Great Depression. But on the other hand,
There's always a but, isn't there?
the recovery, it was slow, and for a lot of countries, it was really painful. The economic scars, they were deep. Unemployment stayed high for years in many parts of the world, and growth was, well, it was sluggish.
So the immediate crisis, maybe they avoided that, but the long-term consequences, they were significant. What about the social impacts we talked about earlier? Did those improve as the economy as it started to recover?
Unfortunately, no, not completely. Some measures were taken to try and address the social fallout, but the crisis, it really exposed these deep-seated inequalities, and they persisted even after the initial shock had subsided. Poverty rates, they remained high in a lot of countries, and that gap between the rich and the poor, it just kept widening.
It's a reminder that these economic crises, they have these long-lasting social consequences even after the headlines fade. Did this prolonged period of hardship, this uncertainty, did it have any impact on the political landscape? Did it change the way they viewed the world, their place in it?
Absolutely, it did. The crisis, it really fueled this sense of disillusionment with the established order. People felt like the system had failed them, that the elites, they were out of touch with their struggles, and this led to, well, a surge in populism and anti-establishment sentiment all around the world.
Can you give us some examples of how this political shift, how it manifested itself?
Well, in Europe, you have the rise of anti-austerity parties like Syriza in Greece, Podemos in Spain. These parties, they challenged the traditional establishment. They promised to protect the interests of ordinary people, the ones who are bearing the brunt of the crisis. In the
Hold
U.S.,
on, hold on. Before we jump over there, let's pause for a second. This idea of populism, it's something we hear a lot these days. Can you explain what it means in this context? What are the defining characteristics of this political trend?
that's a great question. Populism, it's basically a political approach that really emphasizes the common person, right? And often it kind of pits them against the elites. The elites are seen as corrupt, out of touch. It often taps into this feeling of resentment, disillusionment with the status quo. The promise is to shake things up, give a voice to those who feel like they're not being heard.
So it's a reaction to this perceived disconnect between the rulers and the ruled.
Exactly. And in the aftermath of the financial crisis, that feeling of disconnect, it was amplified. People felt like the system was rigged against them. The banks, the politicians, they bailed themselves out, and ordinary people, well, they were left to suffer the consequences.
So the crisis, it created this fertile ground for populist movements to take root and grow.
It did. And it's important to remember that populism, it can take different forms. You see it on the left, you see it on the right. On the left, it often focuses on economic inequality, social justice. On the right, it tends to be more about national identity, cultural anxieties.
It sounds like a complex thing, multifaceted. We could probably spend a whole episode just on that. But for now, let's bring it back to 2008. How did this populist surge, how did it play out in the U.S. specifically?
Well, in the U.S., a prime example is the rise of the Tea Party movement. It's emerged in 2009, and it was a direct response to what they saw as government overreach in the wake of the crisis, the bailouts, the stimulus packages, all of that.
So they were pushing back against what they saw as too much government intervention in the economy.
Exactly. The Tea Party, they were all about lower taxes, less regulation, a smaller role for government in general. And they tapped into this anger, this frustration that a lot of Americans felt, this feeling that the government wasn't representing their interests.
Sounds like the crisis, it sparked a debate about the role of government, a debate that we're still having today. But before we get into that, I want to shift gears a bit and talk about the lessons learned. Did the world learn anything from this near-death experience? Did it lead to any lasting changes in the way we think about finance, about economics, about the global system?
That's the million-dollar question, and one that we'll really dive into in part 3. But I think it's safe to say that 2008, it was a wake-up call, a a stark reminder of just how fragile our systems are, and how interconnected the global economy really is.
It sounds like a reminder that we're all in this together. And as we wrap up this part, what stood out to you the most? What's resonated with you personally as we've gone through this complex story?
For me, it's the human stories behind the statistics. It's so easy to get caught up in the numbers, the economics, the finance, but these events, they have real consequences for people's lives. I was reading a story recently about a family in Nevada. They lost their home during the crisis, both lost their jobs, struggling to make ends meet, ended up living in their car for months before they were finally able to get back on their feet.
It's heartbreaking to think about the hardships so many people faced. Behind the numbers, there are real people, real families whose lives were just turned upside down.
Absolutely. And that's why it's so important to learn from the past, to understand how these crises happen and what we can do to prevent them from happening again. Well said. And on that note, we'll wrap up part 2 of our deep dive. Join us for the final part where we'll delve into the lasting legacy of the 2008 financial crisis. We'll explore how this event continues to shape our world today and what lessons we can carry forward as we navigate the complexities of the global economy and the challenges of the 21st century. Welcome back to the deep dive. We've been through a lot, haven't we? That initial shock of the 2008 crisis, then the global response, that scramble to contain it, and then that long, painful recovery. Now, in this final part, we're going to get into something even more, I don't know, intriguing, I guess. The lasting legacy of this whole thing. How did 2008 reshape the world we live in, like today? And what are the lessons we can learn from it?
It really is amazing how something that happened over 15 years ago, it still has this huge impact. 2008, it wasn't just like a blip. It was a turning point. Changed the way we think about finance, economics, even the role of government.
So it wasn't just the immediate stuff, the bailouts, the recession. There were these ripple effects that went way beyond that. Where do you see those ripple effects the most? Like, what stands out?
I think one of the biggest, most lasting impacts has got to be the focus on financial regulation. The crisis, it showed all these flaws in the system, right? Too lax, too much risk, didn't protect consumers. So after that, it was like everyone was trying to rewrite the rules.
We talked about Dodd-Frank here in the U.S., but was this a global thing? Did other countries also, tighten up their regulations?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. It wasn't just one country or region. It was global. Everyone realized that,
Yeah.
that the old way, it just wasn't working. So you had things like the Basel III Accord, this global framework, strengthened capital requirements for banks, made them more resilient so they wouldn't, collapse at the first sign of trouble.
So basically, they were trying to build a more stable and more solid foundation for the whole global financial system. Did it work? Is the system safer now?
Well, that's the big question, isn't it? And people are still debating it. I mean, the reforms, they definitely made things safer, but some people argue that it's not enough, that there are still, weaknesses in the system, things that could lead to another crisis.
So even with all these changes, there's still this sense of unease, like we're not totally out of the woods yet.
Yeah, exactly. That crisis, it really shook people's faith in the whole system. And trust, once it's broken, it's hard to get back. It's like a crack in a vase,
Yeah.
You can glue it back together, but you can still see the scar.
That's a good analogy. And speaking of cracks, did the crisis also expose any cracks in the idea of globalization? Did it fuel any kind of backlash against it?
Oh, definitely. The crisis, it kind of coincided with and maybe even accelerated this growing disillusionment with globalization, people blaming it for job losses, wages not growing, inequality. Is like the system was rigged and the benefits of globalization, they weren't being shared fairly.
Yeah. So instead of, bringing the world closer together, globalization was actually driving people apart.
Yeah, in a way, it created this us versus them mentality, like national interests were being sacrificed for
global markets. And that sentiment, you saw it in the rise of populist movements, nationalist movements all over the world.
We talked about populism before, but can you tie it directly to 2008? How did the crisis, how did it actually contribute to this populist surge?
Well, think about the stories that came out after the crisis.
Right.
All this talk about greedy bankers, out-of-touch elites, they caused the crisis, and then they got bailed out. That kind of rhetoric, it created this perfect breeding ground for populist leaders. They could tap into that anger, that resentment, and promise to shake things up, to put people first.
So it wasn't just about like economic policies, it was about this deeper feeling of being let down by the establishment, like the system was rigged against ordinary people.
Exactly. And it wasn't just economics either. It was like it fueled this skepticism toward experts, institutions, even facts themselves. It created this space for alternative narratives, conspiracy theories, all that stuff.
It sounds like the crisis, it didn't just shake up the financial system, it shook up people's trust in everything, in the institutions, in the stories we tell ourselves about how the world works.
Uh-huh.
Did that erosion of trust, did it have any lasting effects?
Oh, huge impact.
Mhm.
Our political discourse, the media, even how we interact with each other, it's all been affected. It's harder to have real conversations, across different viewpoints, and we've seen this rise in polarization, gridlock.
So the crisis, in a way, it made existing divisions, social and political divisions, it made them worse, made it harder to find common ground.
Yeah, that's right. And that kind of fragmentation, it makes it so much harder to tackle the big problems, the ones that need everyone to work together, like climate change,
Yeah.
global pandemics.
That's a pretty pessimistic view. Are there any positive lessons we can take from 2008?
Oh, definitely. I think one of the most important ones is the need to understand systemic risk. The crisis showed how interconnected everything is, how something small could have these huge cascading effects. It's about thinking holistically, anticipating unintended consequences, building resilience into our systems.
So instead of just looking at the individual parts, we need to see how the whole system works together, where the weaknesses are.
Exactly. And that's not just for finance. It's for everything.
Mm.
Healthcare, our energy grid, supply chains, everything. 2008, it was a wake-up call. We need to be more proactive, identify those risks, mitigate them before they blow up.
It's a call for thinking ahead, right?
Right.
Thinking long term, seeing the potential problems before they become real problems. What other lessons, what else should we be, keeping in mind from all of this?
I think the crisis also showed just how important international cooperation is. No one can solve these global problems alone. We have to work together, share information, coordinate policies, build a more resilient system, a more sustainable system.
A reminder that we're all in this together. And as we wrap up this deep dive, is there one final thought you want to leave our listeners with? What's the key takeaway from all of this, from exploring 2008 and its legacy?
I think the big takeaway is we have a choice. We can learn from what happened, adapt our systems, build a better future, a more resilient one, a more equitable one, or we could ignore the lessons and risk repeating the same mistakes. The choice is, it's really up to us.
Powerful words. And on that note, we'll conclude our deep dive into the 2008 financial crisis. It's been quite a journey, right? Economic turmoil, political upheaval, social change. But ultimately, it's a story about us, about human resilience, our ability to adapt, and that ongoing search for a better future, a more stable one, a more just one, a more sustainable one. We hope you've enjoyed this deep dive, and we encourage you to, keep exploring this topic. It's complex, it's fascinating, and it's really important. Until next time, keep those minds engaged and keep diving deep into the world of knowledge and insight.